So many mobile devices, but so little time to administer all those. How do we do that effectively? And how do we implement security on those as well? That's a conversation we're going to have starting right now.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to Security Plus here at IT Pro TV. And in today's episode, we will be discussing mobile deployment or mobile device deployment. That's the way it should come out because we have a ton of mobile devices. We need to deploy them in a configurable way, a cookie cutter way, and put that security on top of that so we know that everything is good to go and that we're in the most secure environment that we can create. That being said, I've got my man Wes here to help us out with that very topic. Wes, I want to just get you straight out of the gate, and let's just start talking about mobile device management as a whole, right?
Sure.
From the top down. Start there. Tell us what we're looking at. What should we expect to see there?
Yeah, absolutely. As we go through this section, if you're following along with us sequentially, we're in the implementing security, right? And up to this point, we've talked about things like host security. How do we secure our host? Network security. We've talked about things like application security, right? These are a lot of traditional things that we've had in our networks for a very long time. Well, in this section and a couple of shows after this too, we're going to look at the mobile devices themselves. And when you talk about mobile devices and deploying them out, you need to be able to control those because those devices are really non-traditional devices, right? I mean, in today's day and age, for 10 years now, we've expected them to be inside of our networks, but for the most part, they are non-traditional devices, and we have to have some kind of management solution that maybe kind of helps us to break the boundaries of on-premises management. Because think about where your mobile devices travel to. Right? They're called mobile for a reason, right? They don't always stay inside of your networks. They can leave, they can go anywhere, and they can potentially access resources within your company, and it's important to make sure that we secure them. So, Dan, to answer your question, one of the things that we have is what's called unified endpoint management. Now, you're going to see that, or maybe you've heard of terms like, for instance, mobile device management, MDM solutions, right? Well, then what's the difference between unified endpoint management? Because both of those technologies, if you will, give you a single point of management, right? That's just another fancy way to say what we've been stressing out through here, alleviate the administrative burden of decentralized management, right? If you've got 1,000 employees and they've got one tablet, one phone, one laptop, that's 3,000 devices right there, right? So you need that centralized management. However, how does that differ from things like mobile device management? Well, mobile device management is what we used to call it. Unified endpoint management combines these three elements, right? It combines the mobile device management. It also combines a technology called enterprise mobility management. Again, remember, these devices are going to leave your networks, as well as MAM, and MAM is just a really just an acronym that's mobile application management, right? Traditional applications, and again, we have cloud-based applications as well today, but traditional applications would be installed on like a laptop or a desktop, and a lot of times they would have been on-prem. So unified endpoint management is a single point of management that combines all three of these capabilities. And the reason you can't really just say just mobile device management or just enterprise mobility management is because it manages these traditional devices that we've already been managing for decades now, as well as those non-traditional devices, such as things like PCs, laptops, right? These are the traditional ones. Laptops were like more of the first mobile type device, PDAs excluded, right? But then we've got things like tablets, and we've also got things like smartphones. So we need a way to manage all of these devices. And again, it's not just the mobile aspect, because we can also do traditional workstations and laptops. And again, laptops are the mobile aspect too, but we can also manage things like traditional workstations that are still on-prem. So that essentially is what unified endpoint management is. Again, it's not overly technical. It just combines a lot of technologies together to make an overall single management solution, if you will.
All right, great explanation of that. Now, Wes, could you give us maybe a few examples of what some of the products or at least systems that we might see that actually do this work?
Yeah, most definitely, Dan. So give you some, remember that as we've stressed throughout our CompTIA series here in Security Plus, we are vendor agnostic. But again, the vendors provide the technologies that you have to know about, so that's why we're kind of showing. One of them is called Microsoft Endpoint Security Manager. Now, this is a unified endpoint management solution, and it isn't just what they used to call it. Well, portions of it, right? They used to call their MDM solution Microsoft Intune. Well, that's actually kind of been ported over and absorbed into the Microsoft Endpoint Security Manager because it does unified endpoint management of those traditional and non-traditional devices. There are other ones out there too. Malwarebytes has their UEM offering. We also have things like IBM's security, and I'm pretty sure this is Management as a Service 360, as well as things like the Avanti UEM solutions too. Now, what I'm doing here is just giving you some solutions. I would encourage you, go out and research a little of them. They've got a lot of good summaries that kind of tell you why would we want to do this and explaining in a lot more depth. But don't get overwhelmed with any specific vendor, right? Now, I'll tell you, coming up in the next episode, we're actually going to try and show you how we can lock these devices down, how we can truly do management and enforcement of certain security settings, and we'll show you the Microsoft Endpoint Security Manager and how we can apply that. But these are some examples of the technologies that we're talking about.
Now, Wes, when it comes to thinking of mobile devices, probably the best idea is probably going to be our smartphones, right?
Yes.
That's going to be the number one thing that pops in our head. And of course, if you look at the ratio of smartphones when it comes to iPhone versus Android, you get a basically, I think it's still around 4-to-1, leaning toward Android.
Sure.
How do we lock down an Android system? What are the security measures in which we can use, or at least the system that we can put in place to help keep that secure?
That's a great question. And, you know, when it comes down to it, Android, remember what Android is based on, right? It's based on a Linux distribution. Actually, it is the most popular mobile operating system in the world. All right. You probably are running Android right now, even if you don't have an Android-based smartphone and you don't even know it. Do you have a smart TV? Guess what? The majority of your smart TVs have a Linux kernel somewhere buried underneath, right? So it is based on the Linux kernel, and to do the management, secure management of these devices, when we come back to the Android side, is with something known as SE Android, right? Security Enhanced Android. Now, if you aren't familiar with this concept around the mobile operating system, it's part of the Android security model. And more than that, it is part of something that maybe you are familiar with. If you all have been in the Linux world, you're probably aware of the Security Enhanced Linux, minus the double I's there. That's a spelling on, it's Linux, I guess. That's right, Linux. Right, and what this does is it operates, the security model is an implicit deny. We've kind of talked about that before. Remember, just like we've talked about with firewalls, right? Implicit deny says anything that isn't explicitly allowed is going to be blocked. Now, the other cool thing about SE Android is the fact that it does application sandboxing, all right? Remember what sandboxing is, right? Sandboxing isn't quarantining. Sandboxing says we're going to give this application its own isolated space to operate in, so that if it causes any problems, right, any kind of security vulnerability, right, it's not going to affect the surrounding operating system and the other components within the device itself. And that's good for things like protecting things like data leaks, if you will. Now, there's two modes that it operates in. It operates in what's known as permissive, and it operates in what's known as enforcing mode. Now, permissive says, hey, I'm going to warn you, Dan, you shouldn't have done that. Nope, you shouldn't have done that, but I'm going to go ahead and let you do it anyways, right? So it warns, but it doesn't stop an operation from happening. Enforcing is where we need that security, right? And depending on some of the deployment models we'll see coming up, enforcing would be where you need strong security. Your company has personally identifiable information. They've got very sensitive information that they don't want going anywhere. They want that staying inside of the device if you're allowed to use it. So enforcing mode says, hey, I'm going to warn you, but then I'm going to shut whatever that operation is down. So that's SE, and almost said SE Linux. I'm so used to saying that. It's SE Android, and it's part of the security enhanced Linux subsystem, if you will.
Well, that's great. So if you're already familiar with SE Linux, you should be able to seamlessly transfer into working with SE Android. Very cool stuff. Let's start talking about micro SD HSM. This is a bit beyond where I left off when I was doing admin duties. So
Sure.
I'm really interested in this. How does this work and what do we use it for?
Okay, so we've talked about things like HSMs, hardware security models, right? When we talk about things like TPMs, right, trusted platform modules, right? We've got one in each of our laptops. Macs have them, if you will. Servers have them. But I want you to think about the hardware security model. It can be a dedicated device that is actually racked and stacked inside of your data center, or it could be something that is literally like a graphics card placed in a server in a PCIe slot. All right, now, when's the last time you seen a PCIe slot inside of your small phone? And the answer is not likely, right? Not likely to happen, right? So that's where something like the micro SD HSM comes in, right? So micro SD, so think about the form factor. It's the micro SD, little card that you use for storage, right? And you place that in the device, and what it does is it secures the mobile device. But how does it do that? All right, well, what are some of the functions, I should say, that it can do? Well, it can do things like allow you, through that micro SD HSM, to perform your device itself to perform network-based authentication. Can do things like data storage encryption, right? We talk about all of the functionality of HSMs. It can do key generation, rotation, and protection. So you can actually store private keys in there and you know that they're stored in a secure manner. And it can also allow end-to-end communication that is secure. So it's a really, really good thing to have. And the last thing to keep in mind is that it's really super tiny, right? If you ever seen one of the micro SD cards, ever seen them in things like Raspberry Pi, some of the IoT devices, your phones as well, to expand storage, well, now we can expand the security of the device just by putting one of these SD cards in there.
Wow, that's really cool tech right there to be able to take that server level hardware service module, slap it down into the little micro SD and say, you know what, let's apply that to your mobile devices, help keep you out of the security weeds, as it were. Very cool stuff. Wes, let's move on and start talking about the different mobile deployment models. How do we deploy mobile security and just mobile administration in general? And the first thing that comes to my mind is always going to be BYOD. This has been the monolith that's been around forever. Bring your own device.
That's exactly it. And, we think about why did we start using BYOD? Well, that means I can bring my own device into the company. I'm familiar with it. It can do things like enhance productivity because I'm familiar with the device.
Yeah, I remember when this started being a thing. I was a network and systems administrator, and people were starting to buy iPhones. We used Blackberries at the time, right? But everybody was like, oh, I want to use my iPhone. Can we use my iPhone? Can I hook my email to my iPhone? And then we're like, well, how do we manage all this? We don't have the control that we have like we do over their Blackberries, and people didn't want to carry two devices. But I can understand the popularity and why it grew, because you got so much more functionality out of something like your iPhone.
Yeah, and I assume that your company had to stand up a few BlackBerry servers.
Oh, we have BlackBerry servers.
So
yes, we did.
It can be challenging to do this, and that's one of the great things about the unified endpoint management systems today, is that it brings it off-prem and allows you a lot more functionality. Now, when it comes to BYOD, again, remember, it's bring your own device, and the thing to think about is the responsibility. All right. Now, I don't have my phone in my pockets over on a table out of the way here, but imagine I've got my phone, right? If I bought that phone, here, I'm going to use Dan's. Dan bought this phone, right? Dan is completely responsible for every aspect of this phone. And that's one of the great things with BYOD, is that the employee assumes complete responsibility. And that's something I want you to think about in this deployment model. But if the employee assumes most of the responsibility, the security management can be very, very difficult, right? Now, when I say that, it's because there are so many different devices, right? Dan, if you don't mind me asking, do a little bit of social engineering. What type of device do you have?
It's a Samsung.
You got a Samsung.
Galaxy.
Galaxy. I got a Galaxy Note. I had a Pixel for a while. You mentioned iPhones. Look at all the different devices that you have. So security can be very, very difficult in a BYOD type of environment. But if you're a small to medium business and don't have a lot of capital spend on devices, one of the great things about this, and you don't have a lot of sensitive information, might be the deployment model that you want to employ. Why? Well, because the company itself, it's the least expensive upfront cost, right? Well, Dan paid for that device. IT Pro TV, ACI Learning, they didn't pay for that. He paid for it. However, we got to keep in mind that it will be one of it could be the greatest of the security vulnerabilities out of all of these deployment models. So just keep that in mind.
All right, so there's BYOD, and of course now we've just got to move up the alphabet and go to CYOD.
That's right.
Right, this is choose your own device.
You got it, man.
Oh.
Man's on his acronyms. That's right.
Getting better.
That's right. So the next one is choose your own device. And when we talk about choose your own device, now what we do is, as a company, right? So now Dan's talking about like having to support mobile device management in a company that he used to work for. Now, this kind of model would say, okay, here's the spread. We've got 4 devices, maybe 3 devices, maybe 2 devices. Choose the device that you want, all right? You have a limited selection. These are pre-approved devices because your company can have pre-configured security controls, right? They can go in there, they can pre-configure the security controls and then just give you the device that you can choose, right? So you've got a little bit of flexibility. Not as much flexibility and choice as BYOD, right? So from the employee standpoint, but it does reduce the amount of device variety, and it helps to streamline the support a little bit more. However, now we're talking about deployment strategy. It's a slower deployment than BYOD, right? Because now we got the onboarding process that we have to go. You have to make sure that your devices comply to the security policies, and again, your users got to agree with that. And they also might say, well, that's not as flexible as if I could just have my Galaxy Note, right? Or I could have my or Samsung Galaxy or my Galaxy Note, whatever, whatever the model might be. So keep in mind, slower deployment. However, this also does increase the cost a little bit when it comes to the the upfront cost, if you will, on this type of deployment model.
Okay, Wes, so now we have a couple of options in which to choose from, but let's keep that ball rolling because there's a third option that we want to talk about called COPE. This is not something I'm super familiar with. I don't even know what the acronym means. I know I'm getting better at it, but hey, man's got to know his limitations. Tell us about COPE, what we need to know about that.
Sure. So the acronym for this one is, this is corporately owned, personally enabled. And it is one now where we say, now the company, it's the most expensive, by the way, too. All right. So corporately owned, personally enabled, basically it's most expensive for your companies because what happens now is the company assumes complete responsibility. Everything's paid for by the company. But the big thing here is you don't get a choice. All right, so back in the days when they talked, Dan was saying they talked about having only BlackBerry devices prior to the iOS coming out and iPhone. That would have been an example of COPE. We've got one platform. These are the phones that you use. We stood up a BlackBerry server. You use this or you don't get a company phone. All right, it gives, for a company that has highly sensitive information, it gives the company the greatest control over their platform, right? They're not managing more than one device, more than one model, if you will, right? If a company said, hey, all we're going to support is iPhones, that's it, just iPhones. You either get on board with that or you don't have a company phone. That would be an example of COPE. But keep in mind, this while this is the greatest expense, it does the same thing as the CYOD, but it also speeds up the deployment time. It's not really, it's one of the fastest deployment times. We already know what platform we have. We know what the corporate security policy is. We're only using one thing. These match. We're going to set a profile. It's going to stay that way. And there is no shift, if you will. There is no, oh, well, Dan's got an iOS. I know you don't use iOS. Dan's got an Android device. Wes has got an iOS device. And, oh, did I have a iOS policy set or did I have an Android set? How does it, is it rooted or is it jailed? No, we've got one platform. We know exactly what's going on. But again, greatest control, greatest expense.
Well, there you go. You've got a couple of choices in which to choose from. Choose the model that is right for you. One last thing we want to talk about, which is one of my favorite pieces of technology, regardless of whether it's for mobile devices or in-house on your desktop, whatever. I love this stuff. It's called Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, or VDI. Super helpful when it comes to security.
Most definitely. And this is an expansion, more of an extension of the VDI solutions that we've really already talked about, right? So when we talk about virtual desktop infrastructure, we can use things like thin clients, and thin clients can connect to a centralized server, and they can view their desktop, they can work with it, they can log into the desktop, use the product that line of business applications that they need to use, and there's a centrally managed server there, and all of the desktops are basically running there, but we're basically viewing them remotely. It gives your company centralized administration. Well, you can also do that in a mobile-based situation too. And what I mean by that, when we talk about virtual desktop infrastructure, it's the same thing. The desktop infrastructure is kind of like desktop as a service, if you will. You can be connected to cloud-based infrastructure. You can have a fully functional, I'll just give an example because most of the people are going to be running Windows 10. Unless you're running servers, you're going to be running, for sure, going to be running some form of Linux, probably RHEL. But for a desktop infrastructure, you're probably going to be running something like Windows 10. And you can connect with your virtualized device. You have the application sandboxing because it's really nothing more than what you would say is like a browser. It's running in a centralized location, but somewhere else. You still have that centralized management and deployment of applications over the entire desktop experience, and it's viewed locally, if you will, on the mobile device itself, right? The desktop environment itself is fully managed. You're not, when it comes down to it, your users might make configurations. They might make configuration changes if they can. They can be persistent, which means that once they log out of that desktop experience, when they connect back to it, everything's still there. Would be no different than the experience of having a laptop, and I'm looking at my Windows 10 desktop right now. Or they could be non-persistent, right? And we talk about non-persistent. That means the moment the user logs off, the entire desktop environment is scrubbed, or if you will, reset. And the next time we connect back to it, we're going to have a new, fresh, clean environment. So depends on how it's implemented, but it's really no different than the virtual desktop infrastructure that we've talked about when we're connecting with thin clients. The difference now is we're connecting with mobile devices.
Well, Wes, that was a great look at mobile device deployment. We took a look at things like unified endpoint management. We looked at some security methods that we could use, as well as some endpoint or the mobile device models that we might employ in our environments, as well as VDI. You know how much I love that. So that's great stuff. Use that to your advantage, and now you are more prepared for the Security Plus exam to answer those tough questions. That said, looks like we are out of time for this episode, but many more episodes to come in our Security Plus series. As always, we look forward to seeing you there. Until then, have yourself a great day.
Ditto.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.